Okay, if we can start. So our next talk from Vincent, who's going to talk about diachronic indeterminacy.
I think that I have to use this.
Do you know it?
It's that slide, so I speak like this very well. Is it yeah, okay. Here, yeah, that's fine. Okay. So hello everyone, thanks for attending this talk. So my paper concerns persistence over time, and especially the persistence of persons over time. Because a bit of what I usually do in the philosophy of time. The thing is that last year I had the opportunity to teach personal identity at the University of Neuchatel, and I developed what I hope to be a quite original reply to an important objection raised against the psychological or neo-Lockean accounts of personal identity over time to the fiction objection. And this is the reply I'd like to discuss with you today. So here is the outline of my presentation. Here we start with an introduction to the psychological account of personal identity over time, and present what seems to be an acceptable formulation of the view. Second, I will introduce the fiction objection and review some of the existing yet unsatisfactory responses to it, including those by Derek Parfit and David Lewis. Third, I will move to my own solution, which involves a specific kind of metaphysical indeterminacy, and I will detail the main benefits and costs of this approach. And yeah, finally, I will move to my conclusion and make a quick wrap up. Okay, so let's go. The problem of diachronic personal identity by its modern conception in John Locke's essay concerning human understanding. It's the second book, chapter 27. It can be formulated as follows: what is required for a person to persist from one time to another. So more specifically, under what logically necessary and sufficient conditions a person P1 at a time t is numerically identical to a person P2 at a later time t star. And one paradigmatic and popular answer to this question, which aligns with John Locke's own views, is called the psychological account, so Psi, which says that P1 is identical to P2 if and only if P2 remembers that P star an experience P1 had at T. So for example, if P1 received a punishment and P2 remembers receiving this punishment, then P1 and P2 are numerically the same person. The Psi reflects two widespread intuitions. So one, persons differs from ordinary material objects, such as chairs or computer, with respect to their persistent conditions. And two, experience memory provides the criterion of personal identity over time. So of course you can disagree with this, and especially with two. So for instance, Itiolson thinks that the criterion of personal identity should be biological rather than psychological, whereas philosophers like Chisholm or Swinburne think that experience memory is evidence for personal identity, but does not analyze it, as personal identity is taken to be primitive. But this is not what my paper is about. So my paper is really about defending the consistency of Psi. And why it is challenging? Because this consistency has been confronted with three objections: so transitivity objection, the circularity objection, and the fission objection. But I will leave the first two objections aside and focus on the third one. So the fission objection will present the most substantial challenge. Nevertheless, it is crucial to recognize that the first two objections lead to two modifications to the original definition of Psi. So first, the transitivity objection necessitates the introduction of psychological continuity rather than mere connectedness within Psi. So the idea is that what is required for P1 and P2 to be identical is not necessarily direct memories, but rather a chain of overlapping memories. Okay, so this ensures that the loss of a particular memory does not undermine the identity over time. Second, the circularity objection necessitates a shift from traditional memory to the concept of quasi-memory, which does not presuppose nor exclude that the person who has experienced memory at the start of an event E is numerically identical to the one who experienced E at another time T. Okay. So this modification ensures that Psi avoids any presupposition about the numerical identity of P1 and P2 when analyzing the nature, okay, of their identity. To avoid the so of course, these two modifications come with the onset of difficulties and criticism, but at least they provide a foundation for crafting a reasonably coherent formulation of Psi, serving as the starting point for our discussion. So this is Psi star, so P1 is identical to P2, if and only if P2 at the star is linked by continuity of quasi-memories, to P1 at T. Okay. So I hope everything is clear so far. So let's move to the fission objection. Okay. The fission objection, which has originally been developed by David Wiggins, based on a case devised by Sidney Shoemaker. So roughly, this objection challenges the adequacy of psychological continuity as a sufficient condition for diachronic personal identity by showing that one can be psychologically continuous with two future persons simultaneously. Okay. So let me detail this objection. So first, three preliminary remarks. So one, our brains are composed of two structurally similar hemispheres, so the left and the right hemisphere that perform distinct functions. The cognitive studies generally attribute linguistic and mathematical abilities to the left hemisphere, while the right hemisphere is responsible for other abilities like pattern recognition or musicality. Two, the abilities of each hemisphere are neither fixed nor permanent. So, for example, a person who experiences a stroke in the left hemisphere will temporarily experience a regression in linguistic abilities, resembling those of a young child. However, in such cases, the right hemisphere will work to compensate for these losses by gradually relearning the necessary skills to regain adult-level speech. And three, both hemispheres are not necessary for survival. So some people have undergone what we call an hemispherectomy, okay, which is a removal of one of their hemisphere as a drastic but efficient treatment for otherwise inoperable brain tumors and severe epileptic symptoms. But despite these surgeries, so these people have survived and they have continued to lead functional lives with normal language abilities. So, yeah, they have everything needed to be considered as person. Now, these preliminary remarks invite us to take seriously the following scenarios. So this is scenario one. So imagine a person who sustained severe injuries from an accident, resulting in the destruction of a left hemisphere along with some vital functions. In an innovative medical procedure, a doctor transplants the surviving half of the brain into another brainless body, thereby transferring a memory. So according to Psi, in this scenario, so scenario one, the individual who emerges post surgery should be considered, so one, a person, since the transplanted hemisphere will take over the function of the first hemisphere, similar to when one is incapacitated by a stroke. And two, it should be considered as the same person as the one who suffered the accident, as the recipient will be psychologically continuous with her through, for example, overlapping quasi-memories of events. See, scenario one does not seem too problematic. Of course, it would be a different story if you endorse, for instance, the biological approach. More problematic, however, is scenario two. So imagine a person P1 who undergoes a brain accident, but remarkably, neither hemisphere of her brain is damaged. So a decision is made to transplant each hemisphere into two separate brainless bodies. So in this second scenario, the two recipients, P2 and P3, will each have a brain structure that would enable them to recover the skills and abilities of the hemisphere they are missing, and they will both be psychologically continuous with the person who had the accident, namely P1. So in this scenario, C star seems to predict that P2 and P3 are both identical to P1, and by transitivity that P2 is identical to P3, which is, of course, absurd. Okay? If P2 and P3 are numerically identical, they cannot be two. So this is how the fission objection challenges C star and suggests that it may not be sufficient for explaining a diachronic personal identity in all cases. How can C theorists respond to this objection? Well, it seems that three options can be immediately dismissed. The first, C theorists cannot assert that P1 ceases to exist if the surgery is successful, as the individual resulting from the surgery retain essential attributes for psychological continuity with P1, and yeah, they can live normal lives with their skill fully restored in their remaining hemisphere. Second, C theorists cannot contend that P1 is determinately identical to P2 or that P1 is determinately identical to P3, as this would be completely arbitrary. So both P2 and P3 are psychologically continuous with P1 and will eventually acquire the same abilities, making it difficult to justify favoring one over the other. And third, C theorists cannot argue that P1 survives as one person in two separate bodies and a divided mind, as the two individuals produced by the surgery could have mutually incompatible properties. So, for example, one is sad and the other is happy. They can live different lives, and they might not even recognize each other if they were to meet. Right? So yeah, in such circumstances, it would be strange to claim that they are the same person. Okay, now despite these limitations, important philosophers, including Derek Parfit and David Lewis, propose approaches to address the fission objection, and I will briefly expose the solution and the main drawbacks. So first, Parfit argues that the difficulty in dealing with the fission objection stems from a widely held false assumption that survival implies identity. So this assumption leads to the belief that if someone, P1, survives a brain fission, there must result a person identical to P1. And Parfit attributes this common confusion between survival and identity to the constraints of current medical technology, which only enables our survival by ensuring the existence of someone identical to us in the future. But Parfit refutes this assumption by stating that survival and identity are separate notions, and that a person can survive as two separate persons without being identical to either of them. See, according to Parfit, one can have survival without identity. Okay. So in a nutshell, Parfit's solution to the fission scenario is to say that a person P1 can survive a verification as two numerically distinct persons, P2 and P3, who are still psychologically continuous with P1 by having, for instance, quasi-memories of past experiences lived by P1. Okay? So I think that, yeah, Parfit's solution is very clever, but it also has some drawbacks, which makes it unsatisfying. So here are three drawbacks. So one, this solution diverges from a key principle of C star, namely that psychological continuity alone is sufficient for the same person to persist. Instead, Parfit introduces an extra condition. So a future person P1 is identical to a present person, a future person P2, sorry, is identical to a present person P1 only if P2 is psychologically continuous with P1, and 2, P1 does not undergo a brain fission that would create two separate persons, P2 and P3. And this leads to the second drawback. So perfect solutions implies that if a single hemisphere of P1's brain is transplanted, the resulting person P2 will be considered identical to P1, but not if both hemispheres are transplanted into a separate head. And this is hard. Why? Because it encodes the identity between P1 and P2 on external contingency, namely the non-existence of another person, another candidate, P3. So, perfect responds by saying that this odd implication highlights the importance of survival over identity. So what matters most is that the future person shares psychological continuity with the present self, regardless of whether they are numerically the same person. But, and this is the third drawback, it is very, very difficult to accept that identity is not what matters in survival, as we tend to see ourselves and others as unique and irreplaceable. Okay, so for example, this Lewis example, in dangerous situations such as an impending avalanche, it seems that what we care about is whether someone identical to us will still exist in the future, right? Yeah, perfect solutions seem counterintuitive in many respects. Okay, so let's move to David Lewis solution. So David Lewis agreed with perfect that fission is not equivalent to death, so one can survive to fission. But he denies that the two persons resulting from fission are new existent. Instead, Lewis posits that P2 and P3 already existed prior to the fission, but only became spatially separate because of it. Okay. So his solution can be formulated as follows: so P2 and P3 coincided by sharing their temporal parts or stages before the fission, but subsequently diverged by having different temporal parts located after the fission. So the relationship between P2 and P3 before fission is similar to that of a statue and the clay it is made of. Okay? So although they are numerically distinct, they share intrinsic features such as mass, spatial location, material parts, and so on. Two drawbacks of Lewis solution. So one, it leads to the curious implication that two persons may share a single body and have joint thoughts at any given moment, which is much more peculiar than simply assuming that there is only one person before fission occurs. So then imagine you have the impression that I'm alone giving this talk, but what you don't know is that this brain will undergo fission in 30 years, that you're actually listening to two people. Yeah, that sounds a bit weird. And two, so Lewis solution commits to a four-dimensionalist conception of persons as mere aggregate of person stages, which are psychologically continuous with one another, but not with any other stage. And according to E.T. Olson, for instance, this creates uncertainty about what we are referring to when we use the pronoun I, okay, leading to indeterminacy about what things, but even what sort of things we are. Okay, so yeah, this seems to be also a bit costly, and that's why the solution is perhaps not entirely satisfying. Okay, so let's move to the positive part of the talk, so namely my solution to the fission objection. So, the basic idea is to challenge an assumption called the determinacy assumption that lies at the heart of the previous solution and maybe the source of their implausibility. So the determinacy assumption holds that there is a determinate answer as to whether a post-fission person, so either P2 or P3, is identical to the pre-fission person P1 with whom both post-fission persons share psychological continuity. More specifically, the determinacy assumption said that if 1, there is a person P1 at a time t, and 2, there is a person P2 at a later time t star, then it is either determinately true or determinately false that P2 is identical with P1. Yeah, of course, the aim is not to deny that the determinacy assumption serves our practical needs in everyday situations, but rather to show that it may not apply in every unusual situation that philosophers can conceive, including the fission case. It must be acknowledged that the determinacy assumption has already been questioned by Bernard Williams and Mark Johnson, for instance, who explored the possibility that statements like P2 is identical to P1 and P3 is identical to P1 are neither true nor false when P2 and P3 both result from a fission of P1. But yeah, their attempts have been quickly disregarded for two main reasons. So one, they contradict the common belief that personal identity over time is something that can be known from a first-person viewpoint. And two, they betray the principle of bivalence, so true P or false P, which is implied by two fundamental principles of classical logic and semantics, namely the excluded middle. If you're not P plus Tarski is low, so P is true if and only if P. Considering these two drawbacks, I believe that only the second presents a significant issue, at least if we want to preserve classical logic and Tarskian semantics. The first drawback, however, does not pose a real problem. I mean, even philosophers with whom I disagree, like Parfit or Lewis, concede that the diachronic identity of persons can be indeterminate, just as the diachronic identity of material objects can be indeterminate. For instance, Lewis introduced the case of Methuselah. So a person whose life is so long that there are no psychological connection between early and late stages. So Methuselah age 900 remembers none of the activities of Methuselah age 25 and shares none of his desires, beliefs, or character traits. So of course, in a case like this one, one can still argue that identity is fully determinate as psychological continuity is warranted, with the overlapping trick. But Lewis suggests that a more natural view is that some statements about Methuselah's identity are indeterminate in truth value, highlighting the possibility of indeterminacy in personal identity. So, for example, while the statement Methuselah age 900 is identical to Methuselah age 25 is determinately false, the statement Methuselah age 900 is identical to Methuselah age 800 might be indeterminate in truth value. So yes, it seems that if we put ourselves in Methuselah's shoes, it seems possible to be uncertain whether we are diachronically identical to this or that person or stage. However, as I said, the first drawback is more problematic, but hopefully it seems possible to develop a concept of indeterminate personal identity that is consistent with the main principle of classical logic and Tarskian semantics. So this concept of indeterminacy draws inspiration from the way Elizabeth Barnes and Robert Williams address phenomena such as vagueness and the open future, but this concept looks better adapted for fission scenarios. I will come back to this. Let me first introduce this concept. So as you know, indeterminacy can be of different kinds, such as semantic or epistemic, but the kind of indeterminacy I will focus on is metaphysical, or ontic. The metaphysical indeterminacy arises when it is unsettled how the world is at its most fundamental level. So in this sense, it is not merely a matter of incomplete representation that can be resolved through precification, but rather a fundamental unsettledness in what is being represented. So more specifically, I distinguish between two ways in which the world might be indeterminate. So one, under determination, so when there are no states, so that the world is uncertain as to whether something obtains, and 2, over-determination when there are too many determinate states, so that the world is uncertain as to which one obtains. And this is second form of metaphysical indeterminacy, so over-determination, that seems to be involved in the fission case. Perhaps to clarify the distinction between these two kinds of indeterminacy, it is a metaphor that I like. Think of two teenagers, one poor, the other rich, getting ready for a party. They might both be indeterminate as to what to wear, for the occasion, but for very different reasons. So the poor teenager, because she has nothing to wear, so this would be the case of underdetermination, and the rich teenager, because she has too many dresses that would fit for the event. Okay, so she's spoiled for choice, in English. Yeah. Okay, that would be the case of over-determination. Now, my central idea is that the existence of multiple determinate candidates, P2 and P3, creates metaphysical overdetermination, leaving the world unable to determine which candidate is identical to the coefficient person P1. So more specifically, both the determinate state of affairs that P2 is diachronically identical to P1 and the determinate state of affairs that P3 is diachronically identical to P1 exist, okay, but their obtaining is indeterminate. So from a semantic perspective, so it is determinate that either an identity statement IFI or its negation, not IFI, is true, but there is indeterminacy about which one is true. And this indeterminacy arises due to the brute uncertainness between various possible ways the world could be, resulting in IFI and its negation being metaphysically indeterminate in truth value. So this does not imply that the conditions necessary for the truth or falsity of IFI are lacking, okay? Otherwise it would be a case of under-determination, but rather that there is a lack of specificity regarding which conditions obtained. So here it is crucial to understand that within this perspective, there is no special indeterminate state of affairs that obtains. Okay. Instead, there are two determinate states of affairs. So the state of affairs of things being such that IFI, and the state of affairs of things being such that not IFI, and it is indeterminate which of these two exhaustive determinate state of affairs obtains. Well, to be honest, I'm not entirely sure that this concept of metaphysical overdetermination makes perfect sense, and I don't have anything to add to Robert Williams' framework, which theorizes about this concept in terms of multiple actualities. Perhaps we'll come back to them in the Q&A. My point here is really modest. It's simply to say that if this machinery makes sense, then it finds more suitable application in fission scenarios than in traditional cases of vagueness. And this is because in cases of vagueness, we do not observe two versions of max, say, so one bold, the other not, constituting two states of affairs between which the world would be stuck. In contrast, in the case of fission, this case provides a clear example of metaphysical overdetermination. We can't directly observe, right, the simultaneous existence of constituents P2 and P3, which under ordinary circumstances would determinately be identical to P1 due to psychological continuity. Cool. So yeah, I think that this approach of the fission case has many benefits. I will mention four of them. So one, it allows one to accept the principle of bivalence without restriction and thus stick to classical logic and Tarskian semantics. So any statement, including any identity statement, is either true or false. So bivalence is preserved. Even though it may be indeterminate which one is true and which one is false. Two, this approach provides a straightforward explanation as to why we cannot know which of P2 or P3 is identical to P1. All is indeterminate in this regard, and we cannot know more than what is determinately the case. And three, it avoids the problematic notion of multiple occupancy. See, contrary to Lewis' approach, there is never any spatio-temporal coincidence of two persons. So before fission, there was only one unique person, but it is indeterminate whether this person is identical to P2 or P3 after fission. In fact, the proposed approach can be understood as the exact opposite of Lewis' approach in a sense. In Lewis' approach, indeterminacy, albeit semantic, arises before fission. Pre-fission users of the pronoun I are indeterminate in reference, as it may refer either to P2 or to P3, who are spatiotemporally coincident. And the fission resolves, in a sense, the issue by separating the temporal parts. On the other hand, in the proposed approach, indeterminacy arises after fission. So post-fission users of the pronoun I are indeterminate, as it may refer either to a new existent, okay, or to the person who existed before fission. And this seems to be a clear advantage of my approach because it is far more natural to conceive brain fission, so a very bizarre operation, as giving rise to indeterminacy rather than resolving it. And fourth benefit, unlike profits, my approach considers psychological continuity as a sufficient condition for identity, so respecting the spirit of C star, or it maintains that where there is psychological continuity, there is identity. But the subtlety lies in the fact that psychological continuity alone is not sufficient for identity to be determinate. So I think that formalization can clarify a bit the matter. So let's see the relation being psychologically continuous with. So like profits, I think that one must acknowledge that the fission objection enforces abandoning the original formulation of C star's key principle. So for X for Y, if Y is psychologically continuous with X, then Y is identical with X. So this is because two post-fission persons can be psychologically continuous with X at the same time, which is incompatible with the very concept of identity. However, my approach differs from Parfit's one by preserving another principle, which said that for X, for Y, for Z, if Y is psychologically identical with X and Z is psychologically identical with X, then either Y is identical with X or Z is identical with X. So this second principle establishes that psychological continuity is a sufficient condition for identity, as the material implication shows, without specifying which of the two psychologically continuous entities, so either Y or Z, is identical to X. Okay, it only states that one of them is. We have enough time for some objections?
Yeah, you have a couple of minutes.
So, okay, and as for the benefit, let's move to some potential objection. Truly, if I have time. A first criticism of the proposed solution is that it looks like the second of the three options that were immediately dismissed. So maybe the one that says that P1 is determinately identical to P2, or P1 is determinately identical to P1. See, as a reminder, this option was rejected because it seemed arbitrary. Since P2 and P3 are both psychologically continuous with P1, it is not clear why one should be favored over the other. However, the proposed approach avoids this issue by introducing indeterminacy. See, although P1 is indeed identical to one of the two persons, it is indeterminate which one. The lack of a reason to prefer one candidate over the other is taken as evidence of a fundamental indeterminacy in the world with respect to this issue. So the proposed approach does not rely on an arbitrary choice, but instead recognizes the existence of indeterminacy as a fundamental aspect of diachronic personal identity in extraordinary cases like fission. A second criticism takes the form of a dilemma. So if one of the two persons resulting from fission were to die, so either P2 or P3, would this result in indeterminacy? It's either. Both possible answers are problematic. See, if the answer is yes, then it would suggest that the diachronic identity between two persons, P1 and P2, depends not only on facts about those persons and their intrinsic relationship, but also on the non-existence of a rival candidate, P3, who is also psychologically continuous with P1. But on the other hand, if the answer is no, then the proposed approach appears strange, because if the indeterminacy is due to the fact that there are too many legitimate candidates, P23 for being identical to P1, it isn't clear why reducing the number of candidates to 1 will not resolve the problem. So I think that the most natural response would be nice to argue that the death of either P2 or P3 does not resolve the indeterminacy, because the fact that there once was more than one legitimate candidate is enough to perpetuate the indeterminacy. If either P2 or P3 dies, then it will be indeterminate whether P1 survived or not, because it is indeterminate whether the person who died was identical to P. Last objection? No? Okay. Final criticism of my approach is that it requires the rejection of the only A and B principle as defined by David Wiggins. So this principle states that facts about objects other than A and B are irrelevant to whether A is identical to B. So, this objection primarily targets Parfit's approach, as Parfit makes personal identity logically dependent on the non-existence of another candidate. As a reminder, so one implication of Parfit approach is that if only one hemisphere is transplanted while the other is destroyed, the post-fission person is identical to the pre-fission one. But if more hemispheres are transplanted, then the pre-fission person is identical to neither of the two post-fission persons, although the person can survive as both of them. But the situation is less dramatic within my approach. So in case where only one transplantation occurs, the fact that P2 is identical to P1 does not, strictly speaking, on the depend on the non-existence of a second post-fission candidate P3. Because if there was such an additional candidate, it would not be determinately false that P2 is identical to P1. So what depends on the non-existence of P3 is only the determinacy of the identity statement. So namely that there is a determinate answer as to whether P2 is identical to P1. So this is a subtle but crucial distinction. So in short, the proposed approach does not undermine Wiggins' principle, rather it suggests that the determinacy regarding identity statement between P1 and P2 depends on facts about objects other than P1 and P2. Just a